Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the One Thing podcast. We are here with the Anne Chow today. So excited to have you. She is the former CEO of AT&T and was the first woman of color to hold the position of CEO at AT&T in 2019, overseeing more than 35,000 employees, first woman of color. She collectively served 3 million business customers worldwide during her time there. She currently serves on the board of 3M and teaches at Northwestern University, Kellogg School of Management, and is here to talk to us about her upcoming book, Lead Bigger, The Transformative Power of Inclusion. And we are just so excited to have you. I was telling Anne before we jumped on that I was totally fangirling. You've been watching your career for a long time. We're just so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much, Nikki. It's great to be here with you and Chris. And I love how actually you inadvertently promoted me in my bio there. So I was actually the CEO of AT&T Business, not of AT&T, which was one of the operating units within AT&T that served businesses, as you pointed out. But so you like lifted me up already inadvertently, So, but I thank you for that.
It's just verbiage at this point, and I'm gonna keep calling you the CEO.
Yeah. Well, I was one. I certainly was one. I guess once a CEO, always a CEO.
You're just the CEO in my book. I'm so excited for this conversation, Anne, because I think that this is such an important one, and also I think can be a really delicate one in today's world. And I think the way that you approach this in the book is just so beautiful. But I'd love to hear. I mean, obviously, you've got to have some very personal connection to this, given your background. But I'd love to hear what was the impetus for writing this book and sort of going down this not only leadership journey, but really a teaching journey that you're on now too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's it's such an interesting thing. We were talking right before we started here about the importance of work in our lives and the importance of connection and the importance of contributing in so many ways. And that does not end when you stop your corporate job or when you sell your company or when you move on to another career transition. And for me, I've always fancied myself both a student and practitioner of leadership. And this is always, very much from when I first became a leader as it's traditionally defined, where I had direct responsibility for people, which was very early in my career in the 90s, if you can believe it or not. But my journey to this book really started, and I didn't think this was a bucket list item, but it became one, really started back in like the 2010 timeframe when my organization became so big and so geographically dispersed that I found myself in a leadership dilemma. That dilemma was when I was able to be physically present with my people and I could see them and I could shake their hand and we could have a town hall, a rally, a kickoff, magic could happen, right? But when I was not, I felt less of a connection to them, and they, of course, felt less of a connection to me. So I realized that somehow I had to try to replicate that. And it was when blogs were just starting to come out, and AT&T had launched an internal sort of business blog platform for internal use, and I became one of the early guinea pigs. I hired a social media expert who was far younger than me, and I said, okay, I want to start blogging to my people. What do I do and how do I do it? And so over the course of almost a decade, I blogged every single week to my employees all around the world as my organization evolved, was voted by the employees at AT&T as best blog in the company for nine years until actually the platform transitioned. And I found the power of the word to be so impactful, right? And of course, I realized that the more you insert authentic pictures, the more you talk authentically about your life and what you're going through, not just the work stuff that they're used to getting from a 8 to 5 perspective, but the broader strategic perspectives, my thought process. What I so enjoyed about it was they became to know me, and when I would then eventually see them or connect with them one-on-one, whether it's electronically or otherwise, they knew my children. They knew my dogs. I used to say, man, I wish I had more husbands, children, and dogs because I'm running out of material, right? But that experience over that decade sparked this inner writer. And I got incredible encouragement from colleagues and customers because ultimately I took my game to LinkedIn, right?
I love that, yeah.
So that I could start doing this with my clients and partners in the broader marketplace. And that's actually how it all started. And so I knew that after I left my corporate career, just because it would be impossible to dedicate the time and focus to talk about what I wanted to talk about when I had a full-time job, that this was going to be one of the things that I did first. And it has been it's been crazy. I've learned and been humbled so much through the process. And I give homage to anybody who writes a book, who strives to write a book, who writes anything, because it's not, as a hardcore engineer, like in my soul, it's not intuitive at all.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of help along the way.
I don't think it's as easy or as simple or as fast as probably a lot of people think. I always say that the book that comes out in a year took 30 years of corporate experience, I imagine, to write.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'd love to hear how you came up with the actual title, because we often think of when I saw Lead Bigger, the first thing that came to mind, which you mentioned in the book, is we're taught to think bigger, right? And we talk about that within the one thing: think big, act bold, right? And we think about that often. And yet, what does lead bigger actually mean to you?
Yeah, so it's really quite a simple concept. So the definition of lead bigger, it's really all about inclusion. So I almost use them synonymously, leading bigger and leading inclusively, but inclusively and inclusion is much bigger, no pun intended, in its definition in terms of how I strike it to be. But all it means is that you are committed to widening your perspectives to have greater impact and performance. That's it, right? And by widening your perspectives, by definition, you have to widen your perspectives and taking in different data, taking in different ideas, surrounding yourself with different people, exposing yourself to different media than what might feel necessarily comfortable, right? But it's really about widening those perspectives. And what really struck me in my corporate journey, and thank you, Nikki, for acknowledging the fact that this book is really a culmination of 3 decades of experience, right? Because I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner, right? So this is not evidence-based. I cite
That's also a form of research, though, Anne. Let's give you a little credit.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And I cite so many experts throughout the book just as bolstering facts, but this is really based on practical experience on a global scale, right? And so widening those perspectives, right? I mean, it really struck me as knowing that the book was going to hub around inclusion, but knowing that I feel so strongly that this is a leadership topic. It is not a DEI topic. It is a leadership topic, which I'm sure we'll get into. I didn't want to make inclusion, because that word has a lot of bias around it. It's perceived differently by many people, right? Especially this year in 2024. And so I wanted to lead with leadership, because this is a leadership book. When we started talking about, well, what are the ideas behind it? We need inclusion in the title somehow. It occurred to me that we are always, right, for decades we've been asked to think bigger, right? Whenever you're stuck, whenever you're in a growth challenge, whenever you're in some kind of rut of any kind, right? You got to think bigger, right? We've all been told that. And even as children, right? Think about it, as children, we're told you got to dream big, right? You got to dream bigger. But dreaming and thinking are not enough, right? And in actuality, I would say part of that acting boldly, acting bigger, that's what leadership is about, right? So it kind of was like a big light bulb. I felt so strongly that it was the right title, that was really about bigger is about inclusion in a much broader way, right? Bigger is about much broader perspectives that are constantly changing. Technology is constantly changing. The demographics of the world are constantly changing, right? Yeah. Bigger is a necessity. And what I found interesting, you guys will appreciate this, is the contrast. Well, then what's leading smaller, right? And every single one of us recognizes what small leadership behaviors are, right? But I don't know that anyone's actually come out and planted a flag on this is what leading bigger is all about, right? And for me, it is about inclusion. It is about those widening perspectives to drive performance and to have a greater impact on whatever it is you consider your work to be.
Yeah. I'd love to get your perspective on this. I can give some, and yet I think this has evolved so much. And I think 30 years ago, when you started your career at AT&T, this was an even more challenging topic and has really evolved over time.
Yes.
And I love what you said, that this is a leadership topic, not a DEI topic, which I think it can very much get pigeonholed into right now.
That's right.
And so I'd love for you to have a real candid conversation with us, because I know I've looked up in my own career and looked around a table and said, man, I'm the only one that looks like me, right? And I'm the only one here that has this perspective. And I think that that's a problem. And ultimately, when we're building out leadership teams, and when we're building out any type of team, but I think it really leadership is extremely important. When we're building out any type of teams, you have to have people who can bring the perspectives of the people that you're serving, right?
That's
I
right.
think a leadership
That's
team
right.
has to be reflective of who it's leading. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on what this topic actually means to you, and what does
Yes.
inclusion actually mean to you, and why is it so important forever, but especially right now?
Yes. Yes. So Nikki, I felt the same way, right? When I started my career, I was often the only person under 30, the only Asian person in the room, the only female, right? The only, female engineer in the department, whatever the case may be, right? And that perpetuated, quite frankly, in some way, shape, or fashion. When you're the first, a lot of times you are by definition,
Yeah.
the only, right?
Yeah.
So that actually happened throughout my career. In some ways, it's still happening now, right? As I join different boards and get involved in different organizations. So I think that so you're right. So this topic of inclusion, let me perhaps just put the whatever elephant the moose on the table about this, right? And just say what inclusion is not, right? Inclusion is not solely limited to issues of gender and race and representation.
Yeah.
And that issues of gender, race, and representation is what the DEI conversation, sadly, has been misunderstood to be. It also happens to be the largest part and the loudest part of discussion in the DEI set of practices, if you will.
Right.
Right. And so inclusion is about all perspectives. It is about leading inclusively, not only in your workforce, by the way, right? Because today's DEI conversation is very focus on the workforce and workforce representation. But you even just noted a moment ago, right? In your experience with this is why you care about the composition of your workforce and the perspectives brought forth by your workforce is because the market, you want them reflective of a market
Yeah.
that is actually diversified in so many ways, not just gender and race, right? So my point of view around inclusion and leading bigger has really three elements, and this is how the book is laid out, right? I start with work because let's face it, leadership is about getting work done through and with people.
Yep.
Period and stop. It doesn't matter if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a giant corporate wonk like I was for many years, right? It doesn't matter if you're a small business, if you're a nonprofit, right? If you're an NGO, it doesn't matter. Leadership is about getting work done with and through people, right? And ultimately serving people, right? Ultimately, there is a customer, a community, an investor who are all also diverse in their own right? So I tackle the topic of leading bigger in work first because it's not simply about the workforce, right? There are any number of books and discussions about the workforce and inclusion. Again, my experience was when I was making an assessment on, do I have a big idea here? Do I have something different to say than what's out there? A lot of the discussions around inclusion right now are limited to gender and race representation issues of the workforce, right? They don't talk more holistically about the work or a leader's responsibility in creating a workplace that is bigger and more inclusive, that is more trusted, that is more agile, right? So I wanted to start the book that way and just anchor it in work. And then, of course, go into a perspective about the workforce and about the workplace. In my view, being a bigger leader equally prioritizes inclusion in the context of work, workforce, and workplace. It is, too often the workforce stuff gets relegated to HR. The workplace stuff also gets relegated to HR and maybe real estate at times, right? Or whoever happens to be doing your event planning, maybe, right? If you're thinking it's episodic in terms of how you create culture. But really, to be a bigger leader, you are constantly thinking about the workforce, and workplace all the time, right? One is not more important than the other. It is your ability to lead through all of those things. Right? And again, this is very much based on my own experience set and my observation and study of bigger leaders.
Right.
right? This is not this, the fact that we have bigger leaders out there is not a new thing. I didn't invent it. I'm sort of labeling, I'm calling it that, right, as a descriptor. But that's my point of view about it, and why inclusion is, and I will say this is very, very strongly said, but I believe it in my core of cores. Inclusion is a core leadership competency of the modern world. And if you cannot lead inclusively, you will eventually lose to somebody who does. Whether that's from a talent perspective, as you said, Nikki, or whether it's from an investor or customer perspective on a market that you miss, a set of investors that you miss, right? Or your inability to serve the community in which you exist, right? In a way that is compelling, meaningful, and sustainable.
So it feels like it's so important to first define, as you have, like what you mean by inclusive, and then also like state what the goals are of like, if you zoom out enough and say like, well, what are we ultimately trying to accomplish? Like you'd said, like widen your perspective and, add depth to the different thought processes and people that are included so that you get this diversity of thought. And if you're clear on that, then when you work your way backwards, you don't find yourself pegged to just one sliver of what inclusion means. And do you feel like that's helpful? Like zoom out a little bit hey, what is the goal with this process?
So the goals are as they are with leadership overall, right? The goal is performance, right? As measured by whatever you're doing, right? The goal is innovation as measured by what innovation is important to you. The goal is growth as measured by that. The goal is having the best team at all times, not just for today, but that team that will take you into tomorrow, right? And today's team is different than yesterday's team. Tomorrow's team will be different than today's team, right? And so the goal is better decision making. The goal is better culture. The goal is higher levels of engagement. The goal is a greater level of connection to those who matter to you, right? This is not some touchy-feely, like kumbaya thing, right? You will make choices around what customer segments you're going after. There will be priorities. You will make priority choices against which investor base you might be going after, right? You may make priorities around which community organizations are the most to get aligned with you and your objectives because you need them to be successful. And certainly you will make priority choices as you choose the people you surround yourself with and the people who are your partners, your suppliers that you work with, all in support of your purpose and your mission of whatever your business, your work is. So those things, right? And there's so much, Chris, I love your comment about goals because, it's funny. In certain circles that I run in, there's this like constant conversation about, well, the business case for DEI is there, right? There's more innovation. And when you have more diverse leaders, their shareholder returns are greater, right? And I'm like, look, if it was simply about the data, we wouldn't be having this argument, right? We need to help people see much more broadly that this is not just a gender thing. It's not just a race thing. It's not, right? Representation is a step. It's not the end goal, right? And you don't throw out meritocracy or excellence or intelligence when you make choices about people or markets or otherwise, right? These are all just things where you believe that getting perspectives that are different elevates the whole, right? And there's plenty of data and science out there associated with that. And that's, it's kind of one of the quotes that I say in my book is that inclusion itself has been made too small, stuck at the end of the DEI acronym. And I feel that way really strongly. I actually am not a fan of the acronym itself because it oversimplifies three very important tenets and realities in our collective consideration of how we choose to lead.
Well, I think it almost sort of becomes like a box that you just feel like you need to check.
Yes.
Right. Like, right. We talk about that here. Box checked. Right. And that's not what it is, especially when you read your book and understand that this is a foundational pillar of how to lead, especially the next generation. And I love what you just said, Anne, because I think this is an important distinction. When Chris and I do a lot of corporate consulting, one of the challenges that we hear when we start having this type of discussion or we start talking about really diversifying your leadership team, sometimes when they hear that, they sort of associate it with this overly democratic interaction or relationship wherein they don't have the ability to say, this is where we're going and this is what the goal is. And I love what you just said, because you're very clearly saying, yeah, we're still having goals and we still have a priority and we still have a very real business objective, and we could get there faster when we bring inclusion into this conversation and into our leadership and focus.
Yep, 100%, 100%. It's this is, I think one of the misperceptions about inclusion is that it is a squishy topic. It is anything but squishy, right? If you want to choose to not think inclusively about what's happening in your market, what's happening with technology and how it's transforming your industry, what's happening with where capital is flowing in the marketplace, what's happening as it relates to a global talent shortage and a giant labor issue that's facing all developing countries, right? That is upon us. And, several developing countries are really almost in crisis because of it, right? If you're not thinking inclusively, more broadly, even in of it yourself, I mean, you're just not going to be successful in a sustained way, right? And you as a person will not grow, right? I started out the conversation with saying, I fancy myself a student, like a lifelong student and practitioner of leadership, right? And I feel that I'm constantly learning all of the time, right? Through mistakes. I don't really like the word failures because I actually don't think we ever fail. We just learn and we proceed, right? There's success in learning. There's no such thing as failure because we always get up and we move forward, right? But that's how you learn. But it takes a level of humility. It takes a level of vulnerability to realize this, right? And I want to reinforce something that you said and just elaborate on it a little bit in terms of the representation of the people is important, but you have to give them voice, right? You got to give them a chance to also have a voice to influence, right? And depending on the role, you've got to give these people some power, right? So it's about shared power. Now, there's a big difference. One of my biggest bugaboos, right? Because I saw this having worked for and with many large organizations. And it's one of the reasons why I always love my mid-market and small business customers, because they didn't have this as much, right? This night of what I'm about to describe, which is the confusion between collaboration and consensus, right? Collaboration is always good because collaboration is necessary to build alignment against, Chris, your goals, right? Consensus is impossible, right? The more complex, large you get, the more hairy topics you're dealing with, investment, capital allocation strategy, force reductions, whatever the case may be. These are difficult topics. Somebody needs to make the call, right? So if you're going for consensus, you will never get there. In fact, one of the things that I used to do was gauge my sort of the quality of my ability to bring a diverse group of people together in how much debate there was, right? If people landed on something too soon, then I knew I actually didn't insert the right mix of people, right? Either with functional, different backgrounds, generational, educational, geographic, product expertise, whatever the case may be. And we just have to think just so much more broadly than gender and race, right? There's all different dimensions. There's infinite dimensions of different perspectives, right? And that's just the reality we live in.
It feels like there's like this constant pressure to reduce the scope of what we mean when we say inclusion. And it's like, even in my own mind, as we're going through this, I keep having to like force myself to expand that definition so that I'm grasping,
Yes.
It's crazy because it's that word's almost been reduced, but
it has, it's been made too small, right?
Yeah, it's too small.
It's too
and
small.
So even in what you're talking about, like in a meeting, like inclusion can be having the right voices in the room so that you have the correct diversity of thought so that you can move forward.
Right.
And it's just, I had to share that even as we're going through this, I have to force myself to try to expand and think bigger about that word.
That's right. And, inclusion could also mean having a different data set than where you usually go, right? Having a different expert come into the room, one that is very contrarian to what may feel comfortable, right? Comfort to me is always, right? And that's hard to do, right? That's hard to do in terms of recognizing with ourselves. I'll tell you guys a quick story. A dear colleague of mine, we've served in support of an organization for quite some time now. We're talking about succession planning and recruiting from the outside, right, to increase the diversity of the mix within the management team and getting more outside perspectives, external perspectives. And I said something to him, right? I said something to him about it's really important that we have a diverse slate. Okay. And when I said diverse, I just meant different than what we have, right? Because diversity is always relative to something, right? We each are uniquely our own. No two of us are the same, even identical twins, right? On a DNA level, we're all different. Every single human in this world is different. he actually had the courage to come back to me, and he said, Anne, and because he came back to me, this is an email conversation first. He said, I don't know that I care about diversity. I just want the best candidate, right? And I went back to him. I'm like, hey, can you call me? Because I do too. So I'm curious as to what about me saying I think we need a diverse slate is different than wanting the best candidate. That's actually what I mean, right? So he had the courage to tell me. He said, and you just need to understand that with a guy like me, and I suspect with lots of other guys too, when someone like you says diverse slate, I think you're saying we need a female or a person of color candidate, right? I'm like, mind blown, right? Because that's not what I meant at all, right? And he knows me well enough to know that I'm not that,
right?
I'm, I mean, I may happen to be a female person of color, but that is not right, And so we had this very lively discussion about, Chris, your example of he was just like, when I hear it come out of your mouth, I know you don't know what you mean, but what I hear is this, right? And it was it was a very good, robust discussion, right? And I said, hey, next time I'll be a little more clear, but just so that you know, and I'm explicitly telling you, that would be interesting. But if they're not the best candidate as it relates to qualify for the job, that's not what we're looking at, right? But you want diversity in the slate because you tend to gravitate to comfort. You tend to gravitate to geographical sameness. You tend to gravitate to educational sameness, industry sameness, right? And sometimes what you need is a functional rock star, right? Or somebody who's got a track record of innovation or something very, very different than what the company has. And again, it takes a lot of work to find that person, to get them in, and then support them to be successful, right? But these are all responsibilities of bigger leadership.
On this topic, you've said this a couple times in this story, and you said it right before too. And we have been hearing this very consistently from those that are in executive leadership. I have a dear friend that owns a recruiting company, and I've just heard this thread, and you said, and I'd love for you to expand on it because I'm hearing it so much, that there's a real talent shortage. And I'm seeing that across the board with people who own companies, with like I said, people I know who spend their time recruiting. There's real talent shortage. And I'd love to hear what does that mean to you, and why do you think that is? Why do you think that's happening right now? Because I would think that we've got more accessibility to great people than ever, and yet I'm consistently hearing across the board there's a very significant talent shortage.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to start probably at the biggest level that I see, at a higher level that I see, and then I'm going to come down, right? So just keep me honest, Nikki, in terms of making sure that I answer the elements that you want. And these are things that I touch on in the book. So in the book, I have a special segment, and it's called Implications of the Total Fertility Rate, or something like that, right? So the total fertility rate, for some of your listeners and viewers who may not be aware, the magic number is 2.1, right? Which is the average number of children that a person needs to have to ensure that population in that country continues to sustain itself, right? Otherwise, that population in that country will be shrinking, okay? So largely every developed country in the world now is less than 2.1, all right? The United States has hit lows fairly significantly, as you might imagine. Some of the countries who
isn't South Korea like less than one,
like South
0.7?
Korea, Japan, right? They're running into serious issues, right? So much so that the government is intervening to attempt to get their women to have children, right?
It's a lagging measure too,
it's
right?
Like
you're 20 years
measure.
late.
Yeah. Yes. So right. So Chris, to me, the power of looking at the total fertility rate is a lagging and a leading measure, right? It's uniquely a leading indicator and a lagging indicator, right? It's a lagging indicator because it's a reflection of what babies were not born,
right?
But it's a leading indicator as it relates to the psyche of those who are able to give birth. It is a leading indicator of what will happen to the labor population in those countries, right? Which would be, call the working age from age 15 or 16 to 65. That working population shrinks, but the elder population grows. So what happens, right? This is why it's a reality for leadership, right? As it relates to the realities of today's workforce, today's workforce is burdened even more greatly with elder care and childcare, right? I read something, I wish I remembered where it was, but it was calling those of us, right? I'm an old Gen Xer, so I resemble this remark, but it was calling those of us who are in this phase right now, not the sandwich generation, but the hoagie generation, because we no longer can say we're done with the kids at age 21 or 18. Parenting actually goes to probably at least 30, right? As relates to adolescent brains and when they need you and all this other stuff, mental health crisis, and then longevity.
Right.
Older people are living longer.
Yep.
Right. So the being in the sandwich generation of the pressure of those of us who choose to work, who need to work, caring for children, younger ones, and elder care, right? These are real pressures in today's work world, right? And if you want to have a trusted agile workplace with the most innovative and trusted workforce, you gotta figure out what to do here, right? Because you've got to support your employees today and tomorrow, right? Whether it's in benefits, policies, and otherwise. Okay, so to me, the macro picture about the talent shortage is one that you can see in the TFR trends, and you can portend and see some of these countries that they haven't figured it out, right? And so, of course, yes, it's also directly influenced by immigration, right? Yeah. And your immigration policies, because that is also a way historically the U.S. has consistently bolstered our workforce, right? Through universities and then, placement and otherwise, right? So there's a direct correlation in how you think about immigration policy as well, in terms of you need a robust workforce, a labor pool, in order to have a thriving economy, right? In the United States being one of the greatest countries in the world, right, and an economic powerhouse, right, in the world, this is extremely significant for us, right? So now let me bring it down now. So those are some of sort of the macro trends of the challenges, the macro challenges which are faced, which is why I believe that the long overdue discussion about childcare, the long overdue discussion about what women need, okay, to productively contribute in the workforce is different than men, okay? Why? And I have said this tongue in cheek since I was in my 20s, and I'll say it here. It might be edgy, but I feel it to be true. We will not see true equity or equality unless everybody can have babies. Men, women, all people, right? So until that day, we need to realize that there are different attributes, right? There are diverse attributes associated with each member of our workforce, each potential of our talent pool, okay? So that's the macro picture. I think the on the ground picture, because even in my last, call it 10 years, right? 10 years as an executive, as a leader in a big global company, we started to struggle more, as did many companies, around retention, right? Around attrition and other things, right? And what I saw was sort of like this significant shift, and then COVID happened around the world, right? And completely changed our perspective on, I have a personal life and I have a professional life. Right. Work is something that I do, and then I can compartmentalize it and I can go live my life. This is no longer true. Right. Okay. And we all experienced it. We all saw it. And the younger workforce, right, whether it's young millennials, Gen Zers, they have a much more grounded point of view around work is not their life, man. Yep. Right? I can tell you that for me, I'm going to tell you something very embarrassing, but being an old Gen Xer, it was not until I announced my retirement 32 years later that I did not take my laptop on vacation. I am not proud of it, right? But even a big part of Gen Xers, right? You're going to suck it up. You're going to do it. You're going to very pragmatically go about it, right? But that is not the case. I have 2 Gen Z daughters, and that is not the case, right? They want different things. They have a much greater desire to align their personal interests and passions with their professional, roles, right? Whether that's an alignment of purpose and values, whether that's an alignment of geography, right? I know literally almost every Gen Z that I talk to coming into the workforce now, they have geographic requirements, right? I will live here. I will not live there. I will only go work for an organization that is hybrid, that allows me 2 days a week at home. I will not go work for an organization that goes into the office or site or whatever 5 days a week. That is not what I want for my life, right? So I think that the emerging workforce, I don't know if you would say it's more enlightened. I think it's just that they were born of this era, right? And so they know.
Yeah.
But I would also say, to the point of different other workers, right? I just got asked this question by a reporter. Why do you think it is that there are less women CEOs now, right? And part of my answer was, because I think that the pandemic changed the nature of a lot of things. The increase in flexibility, your ability to access, Nikki, to use your words, talent everywhere, was an advantage. And it showed in the numbers, right, of diverse talent in leadership roles. When organizations start ratcheting it back, right? Like I personally hate the whole RTO, the return to the office thing, right? We got to see them back to work, as if we weren't working this whole time, right? I would tell you that in the 3 years I led through COVID as the CEO of AT&T Business, and then emerging out of COVID, I easily worked at least 5 years worth of work. I mean, it felt like 10, honestly, right? But it was not 3 years. It was like took 5 to 10 years off my, corporate work life, right? So, and I know a lot of people who felt that way as well, right? And if I did not have some degree of flexibility, it would have been much more difficult, right? Now, some of that flexibility was mandated until vaccines and stuff like that, right? But I also think that there is an on-the-ground shift in terms of what workers are willing to accept, what they want to seek, right? I've mentored so many younger people, again, either, young millennials or older Gen Zers, on the aspect of patience, right? Like, hey, if you don't like it, just don't bail out, man, right? Like, they don't have any qualms of just, you know what, I'm just tapping out. I'm just going to go travel. I'm going to go travel, become a yoga instructor, get my certificate, and then I'll figure out about a job, right? Like that just makes me extremely nervous. Right? I would never have had the courage or the conviction or the live in the moment to do that. But they do. And it is amazing when you can harness it towards your work, in your workforce and in a workplace. I mean, it's amazing when you can harness it, but it requires a different style of leadership, a different approach to leadership. It requires bigger leadership. So that's why I think it is, right. And, both of my daughters happen to choose, with a heavy degree of encouragement, they both happen to choose chemical engineering, right, as their undergrad, right. And part of my comment to them was, look, man, if you can do this and demonstrate you have that capability and that intelligence, right, and that ability to figure stuff out, you will be eminently employable, right. You could go across any industry almost, right. You could go do so many different things, right. I mean, I was an electrical engineer, and I didn't end my career as an electrical engineer, but it was always part of my foundation. Right. And so, that I think is also important as we think about what this younger workforce needs, and it's what they need, but it's also what the rest of us need and want too. We just may not vocalize it, right? Who doesn't want a flexible workforce environment, right? Who doesn't want the ability to choose to be empowered, right? Who doesn't want to be engaged on their own terms? Who doesn't want to feel great about the work that they're doing, right? I mean, I think the stat is like we wind up working, is it a quarter or a third of our lives? Who wants to do meaningless work, right? So a big part of leading bigger is advancing meaningful work. Yeah. But you as the leader have to create that meaning for your people and for those you want to serve.
I was going to say, I mean, there's a shift in the way that you engage your teams to define the work they're doing in a way that they can see that value, right? Because I think historically it's not been something you feel obligated to do, where you're just like, here's the thing, do the thing. But now you have to really dig a little deeper and help connect the why behind the work. Otherwise, to your point, it's like, hey, I'm not fulfilled. I'm going to go travel around Europe and backpack and then, figure it out later.
Yeah. Right. Or the, what's the latest thing happening now? They're going on vacation, but they're not telling their employees they're going on vacation right there. So they're working, but not really because they're on vacation. But I think there's some term for it. But, Chris, I love how you touch on actually what is in my so in the first chapter of the first segment, right, which is purpose. I mean, this is outside of my introduction. This is where I start the book, right, in work, and I start with purpose because it is the bigger leader's obligation. It is the bigger leader's responsibility to help create purpose for their work group, right? And Nikki, you've been known to say this, right? Which is the power of the one thing is that you don't have to be a CEO, you don't have to be a big hierarchical executive leader. Even if you've got a team of 2, right?
Yeah.
Even if you own a small business of 10 employees, you are a leader of that group, right? Your job is to create purpose, right? And oftentimes, I would encounter managers or others who would be focused on task. They'd just be focused on the job at hand. When I was always what I would call a context gal, right? The best bosses I had were the ones who helped us understand where we fit in to this giant picture and helped bring meaning to our work so we could actually understand, hey, when we don't do it well, this is where the negative impact can come, right? It can harm the customer experience, which then can cause customer retention issues, which then loses revenue, which then impacts profits, right? So I sort of adopted that style of leadership early on and always felt it was my responsibility to talk to the group and reinforce with the groups that I had how important their work was, how relevant their work was, how vital it was, and to remind them that's why we needed to perform, right? And when people are, and this I think is a very interesting thing, one of the most common fears I think in the corporate world is layoffs, right? Especially with pressures on the economy and whatnot, and technology impacting the ways of work in certain roles. And one of the things I fundamentally believe and always told my teams was, look, good people and great performance don't get cut. If the impact of what we do is visible, tangible, and measurable, because I do not believe that you can manage what you can't measure, right? You can only improve what you can measure, right? So it's got to be quantitative. It's got to have hardened goals, but also hardened impact. You're fine, right? Yeah. It's the minute that you stop being able to tangibly deliver and demonstrate that impact, right? And my role as the leader is to help position that and publicize that and cheer that on and enable you. That's when you got to worry, right? I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So
yeah. Have you ever read or heard of Dan Sullivan's book, The Gap and the Gain?
Mm-mm.
Are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not.
Give him a short shout out. But I think he does a good job at defining this thing that is the gap, right? And the gap is trying to measure yourself against like the ideal best case outcome and like the unrealistic expectations that sets for yourself. And I've seen more of that, I think, with like younger leaders than in the past, where they just have this, they feel like they have to perform at something that's past like what is truly possible, or they just measure themselves constantly against this ideal state that's unrealistic. My question is, do you see that as being, a leader that is more inclusive in this wider perspective about that, to identify that in people and try to help them really break that down, to say like it's not against the ideal, it's like let's set these steps, or you know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. So I absolutely have seen this, and as I reflect back on it, it doesn't necessarily just apply to the younger leaders. You see it, I think, more there, and whether it's, hey, these young workers grew up in the trophy generation, they all got trophies for everything, right? They see, right, they're heavily influenced by social media, so they see exactly what organizations and people want to show them, which is only the best, highly curated version of themselves, right? We all resemble that remark, right? As users of social media. You also see it in your star performers, though, too, right? And yes, so the answer is yes, Chris. I believe that this is a leader's responsibility, all right? I believe that it is a leader's responsibility to help bring out the best in each person as individuals, but also collectively as the whole team, right? And, if you were to ask me in my earlier leadership years, let's say within the first 10 decades of my career, before I, understood what some of these words meant, right? I didn't even know about, that there was a word inclusion or anything like that. And you asked me, hey, what is one of the most important characteristics of a leader today, in your view? And I would say to you, it's interpersonal flexibility, right? Why is that? Because interpersonal flexibility requires that you meet that person where they are. It requires that you as a leader flex to where they are, what they need, right? It is up to you because you're their leader.
Right.
You are part their coach. You are entirely their supervisor. You're responsible for them. You're responsible for their productivity, their engagement, right? You can't make them perform, right? You have to inspire them and motivate them to perform, right? Motivate, the difference between motivation and inspiration to me is motivation is external factors, right? Hey, if you get this done by this date, you'll get this big bonus, right? Or if we can get this done, then we can all, take a 1 week vacation and not have to worry about it, right? As opposed to inspiration, right? Which comes from, this work is so powerful and so meaningful. It really, I want to feel proud of it, right? I want to contribute. I'm much more engaged in the process, and it requires both, right? Motivation and inspiration.
I like that distinction.
Yeah. And so interpersonal flexibility is about that leader. And I still feel this way today, right? Interpersonal flexibility is a little bit different than adaptability or agility, which sort of could describe you, or it could describe whole organizations, right? The culture that you're looking to create, right? The best cultures are those which are adaptable, right? And flexible and agile. But that doesn't capture the one-on-one, human-to-human requirement that is leadership, right? It's like that cliche, you manage things, but you lead people, right? Leadership is about getting a group of people to do something, for something, support something, advance something, right? And since the beginning of time, and this is also part of the inspiration behind why I felt so strongly about writing this book, is since humans became humans, work has been important to us and a necessary part of our lives. And the only thing that has transcended, history, cultures, time, is leadership, right? In every forward movement of human society, right? Whether it's the Renaissance era, the industrial era, whatever, the digital era, there is leadership everywhere. Leadership in government, leadership in education, leadership in the private sector, leadership in the public sector, right? So leadership is required to advance progress, period. Right?
Which is why when there's a glaring gap or a lack of leadership, it's so obvious.
Right. Well, which is why when you see behaviors that are small, right, you're like, come on, man. Like, what is, right? How can you not see it? How can you not understand that whether you were given that title, you earned it, whatever, you have leadership is a calling to me, right? It is and I hope you guys felt this when you kind of read the book, was leadership should be a joy. It is a privilege. It is a giant responsibility, right? And it's often, I think, very much taken for granted, especially in today's world, which is why I believe the answer is bigger leadership, right? And I believe that if you don't lead bigger, you will not have the kind of performance and results and sustained impact that you are ideally striving for, right? Now, if you're a short-term focused person, you don't care about this, actually, right? Because it's, there are a couple of stories I tell in the book about, I could have taken the easy route, which was, let me just do this job, get in and get out like other people before me have done. That's not, to me, that was not the right way. That was not leading bigger.
Well, I think anyone listening to this conversation, Anne, would be inspired to do exactly that. And I think it's people like yourself who are stepping up to help to translate this gap for both sides, for the people who are walking into organizations who are maybe will start as somebody who's being led and evolve in those organizations into the leaders of tomorrow and into the leaders of these organizations of the future. And it's these types of conversations that help to bridge the gap between I think companies that are trying to hold on to an older way of doing things and a new group of people who are taking a stand for a different way of work and a different way of life and potentially a different future. So thank you for this conversation and for writing this. I think it's just such an important one. And we always ask at the end of this podcast, what's the one thing that you would want listeners to take away from this conversation?
Yes, I would say that the one thing is that remember that leadership is about the people. It is about all the people, not just the people that look like you, that agree with you, that you're comfortable with. It's about all the people. And it is about the people that are not only in your workforce, but the people that you strive to serve, your customers, your investors, your communities. It's ultimately about people, right? Leadership is about people, all the people.
I love that. And if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Great. Yeah, thanks. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, much less so than LinkedIn. And then people can also go to my website, which is www.theannechow.com.
And we are going to drop the link for the book in the show notes. And I want to personally thank you for being an inspiration from afar for many years and for a very inspirational conversation. today. And like I said, for just really leading the way through this conversation and very, very important evolution.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Nikki and Chris. It was lovely to see you.
You too. Thanks, Anne.
We'll see everybody next time.